Hi, everybody, and welcome to the course of world history. I'm your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today it's fighting in Europe as we dig deeper into World War II. Our essential question for the day is, what were the major events in the European theater of World War II? So, we've already talked about Germany's rise to power and kind of the kickoff of the war there. Let's talk about tactics. The Germans find themselves being very successful with a new tactic called Blitzkrieg. The Nazi invasion of Poland stunned the world with its speed and its efficiency. They were able to conquer Poland far faster than anybody had thought possible. And this was because of this tactic, Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Here, tanks, supported by planes, sped ahead of many of the army units, just shot on ahead, and were able to capture the enemy's supplies. So they would live off their enemy's supply lines instead of their own. So here it is. Step one, attack, puncture. You go behind. You've now got the enemy's supply lines, and you have encircled the enemy's army. They have no access to supplies now. You've got them on all sides. It's kind of donezo for them. This surrounded and unsupplied opponent would surrender, and the regular army could then advance. So this was Blitzkrieg War and highly, highly successful by the Germans in World War II. So Poland itself gets attacked, and within 4 weeks, Poland itself is forced to surrender to Germany. Now, the Soviet Union had joined this Nazi invasion, right? We had this non-aggression pact between the two of them, and both kind of had claims and desires on Poland. So it winds up being, two major powers against Poland, poor Poland, and they divide the nation between them. Once this was done, and the Nazis had no more enemies on their eastern front, they were able to direct their entire attention to the west. Whereas in World War I, they always had to worry about both east and west. Here, Nazis have set themselves up so that they only need to worry about the western front. So next up is Denmark and Norway. Hitler's armies rested and waited during the winter of 39 to 40, but as soon as the winter warmed up and the thaw set in, they marched into action. Denmark and Norway quickly fell to the Nazis, and this gives Germany full access to the North Sea, and they're able to then, benefit from Norway's oil supplies. The seizure of Norway also gives Germany access to iron mines within Sweden. Sweden remains neutral throughout the war and does engage with trade with the Nazi powers. Being surrounded by them, you can kind of understand if they want to maintain their neutrality, they're going to need to be friendly to those who are potentially very threatening to them. Next up is the Battle of France. France had prepared a series of defensive fortifications along their border with Germany. They had fought a major war against Germany, and so they put in place this guy right here, the Maginot Line. That Maginot Line was highly defensive fortress. Highly defensive fortresses. Wow, can't talk. Designed to stop any German invasion from coming in along the French-German border. It was seen as impenetrable. Don't know. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was. The Germans didn't want to test this. Instead, they simply went around it. They attacked through Belgium, entered France through the Belgian-France border, and are able to quickly get behind the French army and capture Paris. The battle for France does not take long, and the Nazis are on the march. By June, we're talking a month, France was out of the war, at least in any significant capacity. Battle of France goes quickly and decisively for Germany. Now, in France itself, we wind up with northern and western France falling directly under Nazi rule. But not all of the French Empire fell under Nazi rule. It was convenient for both the Nazis and for the French to have a separate unoccupied territory that could manage the French overseas empire. So we wind up with Vichy France as a separate, distinct entity. The Vichy controlled southern France and the colonial empire. So it does remain apart from the German state, but allied with it in many ways. This Vichy leadership does sign an armistice with Nazi Germany. They agree to stop fighting with the Nazis. And while nominally independent, the Vichy French regularly do help the Germans because really they're a minor power compared to Germany at this point, and afraid that if they don't give Germany the assistance Germany asks for, that they themselves will be completely taken over by Germany. Next up is the Battle of Britain. Once France is out as a major threat, Germany wants to focus on their one remaining enemy in Europe, right? The Soviet Union, they've got a non-aggression pact with, and everybody else is either already an ally or out of the war. So after France, Germany turns their attention to Great Britain. A naval invasion of Great Britain, right, it's on an island, does require gaining air superiority over the English Channel first. If you try to sail a navy across that channel, English planes are just going to sink all your boats. You have to shoot down all the British planes first to make sure that your boats can cross the channel. So the Battle of Britain winds up being mostly an aerial battle. And for 3 months, planes are going to fight over England in the Battle of Britain. One of the things that really helps the British in this fight is the invention of radar. Radar had been discovered sometime before this, but it was really militarized by the British successfully during the Battle of Britain. And using radar, they were able to tell exactly where and how many planes the Germans were flying into Britain. So a smaller number of British fighters could cover a large area because they didn't have to cover everything. They knew where the Germans were coming in. If you know where they're coming, you just send all your planes there to defend that territory. This was very successful for the British. German losses were very high, and by October, it was pretty clear that the Germans were not going to be able to capture Great Britain. They couldn't defeat the Royal Air Force. They could not gain air superiority. The invasion of Britain just was not going to happen. So what do? You've got one enemy left, and you can't conquer them. But you've got this huge built-up war machine. So with Hitler not believing that it could take out Britain, not right away, Britain was holding out hope that maybe the Soviets might one day help out and turn against the British. And to cut that off, Hitler winds up stabbing Stalin in the back, not literally, just figuratively. They break the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Hitler orders a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union, which they had this defensive agreement with. Now, they were hoping for a quick victory. And to assure this quick victory, they took their big army and divided it into 3 parts. And they were going to knock out the 3 major Soviet cities right away in that first year and take all the wind out of any Soviet attempt to defend. That was the plan. Divide your massive army, conquer more quickly because now you have 3 armies. Doesn't work out well. The Soviets are caught off guard, and they do have to retreat quickly, and they retreat suffering lots of losses, and millions of people. Nobody loses more people than the Soviet Union during this war. But they don't surrender. Instead, they make their stands in 3 locations. In the north, in Leningrad, at Moscow, and at Stalingrad. We wind up having these 3 major areas of conflict. And by retreating, Stalin had delayed any major fighting until the winter had set in. They didn't try to hold this territory. Instead, they retreated to these major cities, and they waited for winter to settle in. The Nazis, who had been planning on a quick victory, did not have winter supplies. And when they were forced to halt as winter set in, they got cold and sick and hungry. And the Soviet Union, very used to dealing with cold winters, was much better prepared. And they organized themselves for a massive counterattack. And that will eventually lead to the end of the war, and we'll get into that in another lesson. But that was it for today. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I'll see you next time. Farewell.